What if I told you that the biggest danger in your life right now isn't inflation, isn't low salary, isn't even a bad economy, but a system you're already inside, whether you like it or not? Let me ask you something real. Why do you work harder every year, but feel poorer? Why does your money disappear faster than you earn it? Why do you save, yet everything keeps getting more expensive? And why does it feel like no matter what you do, the finish line keeps moving? Here's a question most people never dare to ask. What if your entire future is already being used as collateral? In this video, you're not getting motivation, you're getting the truth.
I'm going to show you how debt silently controls your life without you noticing, why governments, banks, and elites need you to stay confused, how inflation is quietly stealing from you every single day, and why history proves that when this system resets, you either understand it or pay for it. This isn't theory. This isn't conspiracy. This is how the world actually works, and you were never taught this in school. By the end of this video, you will understand why entire empires collapsed, why modern society is drowning in debt, and most importantly, what you must do to avoid becoming collateral in a game you never agreed to play. Watch this video till the very end, because if you don't understand debt, inflation, and power, you won't lose because of bad decisions. You'll lose because of rules you didn't even know existed. Let's begin.
The global debt experiment, an unprecedented crisis. This represents the most significant financial experiment in human history, and many individuals are unaware they're part of it. Global debt, encompassing public, private, household, and corporate, has surged to unprecedented levels for any civilization. Nowadays, governments borrow trillions as if it were trivial. Central banks create money at the touch of a button. Families secure 30-year mortgages with the same ease as purchasing groceries. Yet we continue to speak of debt as if it were commonplace, innocuous, and enduring. The harsher reality is that debt has always been a means of exerting power, a tool for control, and a looming crisis waiting for the right trigger. The critical issue isn't if the current accumulation of global debt will lead to a crisis, but rather when it will happen, and who will bear the consequences when the system resets.
The ancient roots of obligation. To grasp how we arrived at this point, we must trace the origins of debt itself. Debt has existed as long as civilization has. The earliest clay tablets in Mesopotamia, dating back thousands of years before Christ, recorded not poetry or philosophy, but accounts of who owed what in terms of grain and livestock. In ancient cultures, debt was not merely a financial instrument, it held sacred significance. Priests and monarchs managed debts, enforced them, and occasionally annulled them during large-scale jubilees, moments when obligations were forgiven to prevent societal collapse. Consider this for a moment. The very notion that the survival of society depended on periodically resetting the financial system. Debt represented power, yet excessive debt posed a threat. Ancient leaders recognized what contemporary authorities seem to ignore, that a population cannot be shackled by obligations indefinitely. Eventually, the system reaches its breaking point. The transition to geopolitical debt. Jump ahead to the Renaissance and the emergence of banking dynasties like the Medici in Florence. Debt transitioned from grain and cattle to gold and credit. Monarchs and popes amassed vast amounts to finance wars, construct cathedrals, and support empires. However, debt always held risks. Spain, abundant with silver from the New World, declared bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century due to borrowing beyond its capabilities. This serves as the initial lesson. Even empires laden with wealth can be overwhelmed by debt when ambition outstrips reality. Debt transformed from being simply personal to a matter of geopolitics. It fueled conflicts, toppled empires, and altered political boundaries. The 20th century surge and untethering. The contemporary surge in debt commenced in the 20th century. Following World War I, nations bore debts so immense that repayment appeared unfeasible. Germany faced reparations as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles, obligations so burdensome that economists cautioned they would destabilize the nation. Their warnings proved correct. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s, where Germans transported wheelbarrows filled with paper marks to purchase bread, stemmed from debt obligations that couldn't be satisfied in realistic terms. That catastrophe left deep scars that influenced the political landscape leading to World War II. Debt was more than a financial issue. It became the catalyst for turmoil. Then came 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. This was the pivotal moment when the financial framework of the contemporary world was established. The United States, possessing 2/3 of the world's gold post-war, crafted the regulations. The dollar became the standard, exchangeable for gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies linked their values to the dollar. The goal was stability, but the outcome was reliance. Each nation's debt, each government bond, and every financial decision now depended on the assurance that the United States would exercise restraint. It functioned effectively for a time. However, the lure of borrowing, of exceeding one's financial limits, is ever present. By the 1960s, as expenses from the Vietnam War and various domestic initiatives accumulated, the United States began printing more dollars than it had gold reserves. Other nations took notice and started demanding gold in return for their paper currency. In 1971, Richard Nixon abruptly ended the dollar's connection to gold. Debt became untethered, allowing governments to borrow and create money without limits, constrained only by trust. That year marked a significant shift, changing debt from a finite resource into an infinite one. With gold no longer a factor, central banks realized they could adjust interest rates to influence the economy. When economic growth slowed, reduced rates encouraged more borrowing. In times of crisis, additional debt was created to fill the gaps. Each rescue operation needed more leverage than the previous one. The 1980s witnessed significant increases in public debt under leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, rationalized as essential for defense or economic reform. Developing nations heavily borrowed from Western banks, resulting in the Latin American debt crisis when they were unable to repay. A clear pattern emerged: utilize debt in the pursuit of prosperity, then struggle when the circumstances change. The 2008 financial crisis was not merely about housing, as many believe. It stemmed from layers of debt, a leverage pyramid so extensive that when one part faltered, the entire structure trembled. Mortgages were bundled into securities, marketed to investors, insured with derivatives, and magnified by leverage ratios of 30-1. The fallout caused the collapse of banks, the loss of pensions, and compelled governments to step in with trillions in bailouts. The bitter twist was that those who borrowed irresponsibly were saved, while everyday citizens faced job losses, foreclosures, and austerity measures. Debt was exposed not as an impartial tool, but as a system designed to favor the influential. The astounding modern accumulation. Since then, the figures have escalated from concerning to astounding. Over the last 2 decades, global debt has tripled, surpassing $300 trillion by 2023. To put this into context, this amount is nearly 4 times the total global economy. Governments, corporations, and households all have accumulated more debt. Some countries, like Japan, now hold public debt exceeding 200% of their GDP. The United States consistently adds trillions without much discussion. Emerging economies borrow in foreign currencies, putting themselves at risk of sudden failure when interest rates rise. The entire system has become a precarious balancing act, where stability hinges on the belief that debt can continuously expand without any repercussions. Yet, debt always carries consequences. It skews behavior. It generates bubbles. It redistributes wealth. And most critically, it binds future generations. Every dollar borrowed now represents a future obligation. When the amounts become excessive, repayment turns infeasible. This explains why history is rife with defaults, restructurings, inflation, and crises. Debt ultimately resolves in one of three ways. It is repaid honestly, inflated away, or defaulted on. No empire or system has ever managed to avoid this reality. The current consequences are evident everywhere, yet most individuals fail to recognize them because debt has become concealed. Consider this. When a government operates with a deficit, it doesn't come directly to you for money. Instead, it issues bonds, sells them to financial institutions or foreign stakeholders, and discreetly racks up a bill in your name. When you use a credit card, you're not making a payment, you're accruing debt. When companies report record profits, these gains are often enhanced by borrowed funds used for stock buybacks. The entire structure relies on leverage. However, leverage operates like gravity. It's undetectable while ascending, but can be heavy when descending. The whole financial framework today is sustained by commitments that might not be fulfilled. The great powers and the debt trap. Consider the United States, the cornerstone of the global order. Its national debt exceeded $34 trillion in 2024. That amount is so staggering that it feels abstract, but make it concrete. Every taxpayer is responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in liabilities. Interest payments alone now rival military expenditure. This implies that the world's leading superpower is borrowing just to cover the interest on its existing debt. This scenario is not uncommon. Throughout Europe, nations such as Italy and Greece continue to have debt-to-GDP ratios significantly exceeding 100%. In China, the explosion of debt is concealed within local governments and state-owned companies, creating hidden liabilities that could be much larger than the official numbers indicate. Everywhere you turn, debt has spread widely. The psychological trap is as significant as the financial one. Politicians favor debt because it grants them additional time. Increasing taxes frustrates citizens. Reducing expenditures upsets even more people. However, borrowing appears to be without pain. Future generations will handle it. This illusion functions until it collapses. When interest rates increase, the actual burden suddenly becomes apparent. This is precisely what we observed since 2022, when central banks elevated rates to combat inflation. Suddenly, the costs of managing debt soared. Governments encountered stricter budgets. Households dealt with increasing mortgage payments. Corporations witnessed their refinancing expenses skyrocket. Debt resembles a dormant predator, innocuous while it sleeps, lethal when it stirs. Yet, even as the hazards intensify, debt is still promoted as a pathway to success. Students are encouraged to incur large amounts of debt for degrees that may not guarantee a return. Families are urged to go to great lengths to purchase homes they can scarcely afford under the assumption that real estate perpetually rises in value. Countries are reassured that deficits are irrelevant because central banks can print infinite amounts of money. This represents the great misconception of contemporary finance, that debt is free, limitless, and secure. History shouts a different message. The three ways debt is resolved. What follows is not difficult to predict if one has studied economic history. There are only a few avenues available when debt accumulates excessively. One option is inflation, unwittingly diminishing the worth of what is owed by devaluing the currency. This is already unfolding. When prices escalate by 10%, your savings lose 10% of their purchasing power, while your government's debt decreases by the same proportion. It acts as a concealed tax, and it is politically more palatable than defaulting. The second option is restructuring, acknowledging that the debt cannot be honored, and revising the terms. We witnessed this with Greece during the Eurozone crisis when bondholders had to bear losses. The third option is outright default, refusing to make any payment. Historical precedents of sovereign defaults litter the timeline from Argentina to Russia, each occasion inciting chaos. None of these alternatives is devoid of suffering. All these are variations of breaking a vow. So what direction are we heading in? The indicators suggest that inflation is the favored route. Central banks may act as if they're combating it, but governments burdened with debt actually require it. They rely on the diminishing real value to make their financial commitments manageable. This implies that the burden will fall on everyday people, you. Your savings, income, and future buying power will be depleted to maintain the system. This is the most ancient tactic, yet individuals continually fall for it because inflation sneaks in, because the figures seem abstract, because the system teaches us to think that debt is an issue for someone else.
Conclusion: debt, power, and self-preservation. But here's the key point. Debt extends beyond economics. It encompasses power dynamics, who lends, who borrows, and who receives assistance when crises occur. The financial system is structured so that when debt becomes overwhelming, the powerful typically do not bear the burden. Banks receive bailouts. Corporations reorganize. Politicians step down. Meanwhile, everyday people suffer loss of homes, jobs, and hope. This is why grasping the concept of debt transcends financial literacy. It is a matter of survival. If you fail to see the snare, you will live within it without even being aware of your confinement. So what should our course of action be? First, remove the deceptions. Acknowledge that debt carries weight. Every dollar borrowed comes with repercussions. Second, observe the historical trend. No empire, no country, no system has been able to escape a reckoning with debt. The timelines may differ, but the end result is always consistent. Third, safeguard yourself. This doesn't imply panicking or hiding gold in your backyard. It involves creating genuine wealth that isn't solely dependent on paper assurances. Assets that retain value throughout market fluctuations. Knowledge that pierces through the falsehoods. Understanding that prevents you from falling for the same old tactics, because the system will persist in repeating them. This is the lesson imparted by history. Debt accumulates, leaders deny it, crises arise, and societies reboot. Your only option is whether to confront that cycle with clarity or ignorance. If you comprehend the traps, you can steer clear of becoming a casualty. If you don't, you will suffer the consequences of errors you never committed. Global debt is not merely a statistic on a spreadsheet. It casts a shadow over our future. Unless we learn from it, it will overpower us, just as it has every empire in the past. If this offered you a fresh perspective, please subscribe. History holds the keys.